In this video, we are going to talk about HyperV Replica on Windows Server 2012 R2, and we are also going to implement HyperV Replica using PowerShell. HyperV Replica, as the name suggests, is a technology that replicates virtual machines from one Hyper-V host to another. Replication can be done at a specific time interval, which can be 30 seconds, 5 minutes, or 15 minutes. In the past, in Windows Server 2012, you could only replicate at a 5-minute interval, and now the 5-minute interval is the default, but you can also choose the other two options. You can also enable additional recovery points, which basically are Hyper-V snapshots, so that if your host crashes and the last replica that happened isn't really consistent, you can go back to the last snapshot and at least have a consistent state for your virtual machine. And HyperV Replica does not only let you replicate machines, it also has a failover technology in which you can perform a failover from a replica host so that the new machine will become the active machine, the primary machine. And speaking about failover, let's see the three types of failovers we have. First is the test failover, in which you will not lose any data and it's really only a test. So the way it happens is when you initiate a test failover, your primary machine keeps running and your production keeps running, and on the replica host, your virtual machine will be copied and started up in a separate network, let's say in your test network. You can check that everything is okay or whatever you want to check, and then when you finish the test failover, it will delete the test machine and nothing actually will be changed in your environment. The next failover type is the planned failover. Now in this scenario you know that a failover will happen, you are not taken by surprise, so you will not lose any data. How this failover works is that you stop the primary machine, you initiate the failover process, so you will failover to the replica server, and after everything is done you can also reverse the replication, so your failover machine will now be the primary one. The last failover type is the unplanned failover. And of course, as the name suggests, this will happen when your host, your primary host, for example, goes down, and you have to bring up the replica machine. And of course, you can lose data because you can't control when a host works or when it fails. But this failover is similar to the planned one, just that your primary host usually will not be available, so reversing the replication, I guess, for some time will not be possible. You will run with only your replica machine. Now, something new in Windows Server 2012 is the possibility to have an extended replica. What this means is that from your replica machine, you can initiate another replication to a third Hyper-V host. This replication can be done only at 5 or 15 minutes, but this value cannot be lower than the value of the replication between the two primary servers. So you cannot replicate on the two primary servers at 15 minutes and then replicate to the third one at 5 minutes. And one possible scenario for this is if you have Hyper-V Replica in your environment from one host to the other, and you want one extra measure of security, you could replicate your replica to an external service provider, so you have another copy. Or it could be the other way around. You could have only one Hyper-V host in your environment, replicate the machine to a provider, and that provider can also replicate it again in its data center. Let's go and actually configure HyperV Replica and see how it works. I'm now on my domain controller in my test environment. I'm connected to HV01, one of my HyperV servers with PowerShell remoting, and I'm also connected to HVS01 and HVS02, so I have 3 HyperV servers. Let's first create 2 test virtual machines on HV01, so we can initiate the replica part. And one more thing we need to do before we start replicating machines is enable and configure replica on our hosts. And with this command, you see that we can enable replica, we can configure the authentication between the hosts, we can set a default location where the replicas will be stored, and we can configure an extra security measure to allow only specific servers to replicate to this host. In my case, I don't need it, so I will allow any other HyperV server to send the replicas to this one. So I'll run the command on HV01, and I will also copy it and run it on the other 2 servers. Now, if you want to set this to false, so you want to configure the trusted servers, this is what you can use, this command. And to remove a server from the trusted list, you can use this command. But like I said, we don't need it in this scenario. And before we enable replica, we also have to configure the firewall to allow this firewall rule for inbound traffic. And again, this should be done on all your HyperV servers that will use replica. Now with this out of the way, we can actually enable replication for a VM. And this is the command to do it. We just specify the machine name. We specify on which server we want to send the replica. We can also enable compression. We can tell it to create 3 recovery points if we really want to. This is the port that it will communicate on, and Kerberos will be the authentication type. Let's enable it. Now replica for this machine is enabled, and before I go on with the PowerShell, in the graphical interface you will see some replication info in this tab for a machine, and you see that it's primary, pending initial replication, and it's in warning state. And the reason it's in warning is because we enabled replica, but we did not make an initial replication. So this is the command you need to use to start a replication. And since the machine is very small, actually it should already be finished. And you see that the state is replicating and health is normal. And this is the way it should be. And since I did not specify a replication interval, it will use 5 minutes because it's the default. We have a command named measure VM replication, which will show us for each replication cycle how much data did it replicate, how much it took, and so on, which is very helpful if you want to also monitor your replication performance. We can pause the replication with suspend VM replication, and we can resume it with resume VM replication. So very simple commands to remember. But the interesting thing is that we can also perform failovers using PowerShell. And for a planned failover, these are the steps that we have to take, the next 3 commands. First, this command we have to run it on the primary host, so on HV01. So we now prepared the replication. And the next two commands will have to be run on the replica host. So this one. And the reverse. So now the replica will actually be the primary after we reverse the replication. And if we actually use the get VM replication command, you see that the mode on HV01 is now replica because it's not the primary anymore. The primary is now HVS01. And this is how easy it is to do a planned failover. Let's also go to the unplanned failover. So we try also this one. So let's start the replication. And since HVS01 is the primary and we consider this one not reachable anymore, we consider that only the replica server remains and we want to recover this machine on our replica server. Now, since we don't have snapshots, we will just have to modify this command a little because we need to use the VM name. So we start the failover and we also complete the failover right now. And at this stage we could power on the machine and use it. Now if at some point the primary host comes back up, we can also continue to configure the machine on that one. So if HVS01 would be back up online, we would run this command to set its machine as a replica now, because it doesn't know that a planned failover happened. And now we would also reverse the replication on HV01. And we would start an initial replication back to HVS01. And with this, we also completed a full cycle of an unplanned failover. Now the last thing I want to do in this video is also go through and configure an extended replication. So for test VM01, we will replicate it from HV01 to HVS01. And in this case, I will set the replication frequency to 30 seconds. And we will start the initial replication. And now to replicate it a second time, we can go to HVS01 and run basically kind of the same commands. So on HVS01, we run enable VM Replica to HVS02. And we start an initial replication. And if we go to HyperV Manager to test VM2 on HVS01, in replication you see that you have two tabs. One is the replica that comes from HV01 and the other is the replica that goes to HVS02. And that was mostly it for HyperV Replica and using it with PowerShell. If you liked the video, please leave a like and share it. Also consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.